Welcome to the groundbreaking podcast that will reshape your life. Get ready for an inspiring journey of self-discovery and personal transformation. This is Redesign Your Reality with me, your host, the seasoned entrepreneur and spiritual guide, Randy Lyman. Hi, I'm Randy Lyman here with Camille, the CEO of Way Media and Marketing. And Camille, I'm hoping, has some really great questions for me, as she always does.
Yes. So today I'm really excited to talk about vulnerability. This is a topic I've written chapters about in anthologies, and I really want to hear your take. What does it mean to be vulnerable to you, Randy?
To try and summarize it, to have an open heart, to be at a place where we're not guarded, and for us to open our heart, to be vulnerable, to be open to attack, to be judged, to be hurt in some way. To me, that's vulnerability. But if we are guarded in any way, we close down our heart. And when we close down our heart, then we're not allowing ourselves, our higher spiritual, emotional self to come through. Then we're just cold and calculated. And at times we need to do that. If we're in a situation where we have to make a life and death decision, then we want to turn off our emotions. We do want to just make the right decision at the moment without our emotions. But as we learn to become more comfortable with our emotions, we can be open and vulnerable and still make good decisions. But vulnerability requires strength. It requires that we understand that who we are is not who we appear to be on the outside. It's not our actions. It's not our family. It's not what we're wearing. It's not what we drive. Who we are is so much deeper than that. And so when we connect with who we are at a deeper level, and we know that our value is not based on what people see, but who we are at that deeper level, then we know that we can be vulnerable, and who we are at the deeper level is not going to change, even if other people judge us. So when we get to that place of no fear of judgment from the outside, and we are comfortable being vulnerable because we know that nobody else can really do anything to us if we don't allow ourselves to react emotionally, then we find a strength that's really huge, and we open up our heart for an experience that's so much deeper, a human experience that is emotional in positive ways. Because sometimes people look at emotions and think they're only negative, but we have negative, positive, however you want to label them or experience them, all this vast spectrum of emotions. And the only way I think that we can really be heard and that we can really have a true relationship with somebody, anybody, even on a business level, is to be vulnerable. Be open to whatever happens, to not be judgmental, to not be closed off, to just say, okay, what is God's truth? And how am I going to work through that? And to know that there is a solution, there is an answer, and being vulnerable is not going to limit me or put me in a position where someone's going to take advantage of me if I don't have any fears to be reactivated.
So much good stuff here. All right. So where do I want to go with this? In society, a lot of times we're told to be strong, to hold our emotions in. Vulnerability has always been something that people have seen as weakness for a long time. I think we're starting to reframe what vulnerability really means. How can someone gain the courage to be vulnerable? Because really vulnerability is courage. So talk to me about this. Yes, it is.
So before we can have courage, we have to deal with our underlying fears. Courage means doing what we have fears around, even though we have the fear. But if the fear is so large because our wound is so large and we don't want to reactivate and feel that old wound, whatever it is, shame, pain, betrayal, whatever it is, loneliness, then we're going to guard our heart. We're going to guard ourselves from our feelings, and we're not going to go there. We're going to shut off our emotions. Also, when we see people in our lives, like in my neighborhood, some of my friends' parents were emotional and they made a lot of dumb decisions. And I learned early, if somebody's emotional, they're going to make bad decisions. Well, the problem is they didn't have a balance between their mind, their logical mind, their intuitive self, and their emotions. And they made decisions based on their emotions. And we see people make bad decisions based on emotions. So then we stereotype and we kind of pigeonhole, anybody who's emotional makes bad decisions and they're not logical and reasonable. Well, that's not the case. We can be a balance of all things. But we tend to be afraid of those people who have made a mess of their life by being emotional and label all emotions based on those 1 or 2 or 10 people that we've had experiences with.
Yeah, I think a really good example of that is someone who you see has a lot of anger, right? Because anger is a very powerful emotion, and you can see people's lives ruined from anger. So absolutely, that makes a lot of sense. Do you want to go into that?
Yes,
I can
absolutely.
sense you're itching.
So anger is a thing I had a challenge with for so much of my life. And at times I still have things that I'm angry about because I'm human and I'm afraid these people outside of me are somehow going to affect my reality. So anger is a tool to protect ourselves. Now, the ironic thing is when we're angry, we create more problems and more challenge in our life. Whereas if we just accept the anger, feel it, and go to a deeper level, anger is usually not the core emotion. Anger is a response to emotions we don't want to feel. I don't want to feel alone. I don't want to feel left behind. I don't want to be in a place where I'm going to lose my job and I can't take care of my family and my children starve. Is that extreme? Absolutely, it's extreme. But to the emotional self, to the child self that still lives in all of us, hopefully, because it's joyous and creative, that's scary. All these awful things might happen. And so then if these awful things might happen, and I make up that story in an instant in my mind, and at the same time, my old emotional wounds are reactivated, then I could react in fear to shut down that person that I'm afraid is going to reactivate those feelings in me, or my mind says is going to create a bad reality for me. So fear is a surface protection to keep us from our deeper emotions.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back to vulnerability for a second specifically. You know, as a book coach and someone who's helped people write books, I talk a lot about the importance of vulnerability for connection. When you're writing a book and there's no vulnerability in the story, the reader's going to have a really hard time connecting to that story. And I think that's very true in real life, right?
It is. So myself being a scientist and a business person and having a very logical background, I'll look for the logic and reason in that. But that's a dry way to look at life. Life is so much deeper than that. And most people want the story. And now I'm realizing myself, I'm more attracted to books with the story. I didn't realize that about myself because I didn't want to admit it. I went, oh no, I'm just good and stuck in logic here. It's going to work for me. But we're human and our whole life is a story. So when we're vulnerable, it gives the other person, not necessarily permission, it gives them a feeling of safety to being vulnerable. Because they know if we're vulnerable, we're in our heart and our heart is open and our heart is not going to attack them. Our mind will attack them. Our old emotional wounds will attack them. But when we're vulnerable in a place of truly feeling compassion, love, our deeper emotions, and from a fluid place, not from a blocked place or emotional reaction, it sends a signal to the other person. The other person senses this person's safe. I can listen to them. I can interact with them. I can open myself up to them. And when they open themselves up to us and they truly hear us, not just with their ears, but with their mind and their heart. Because when a person has to protect themselves from us because we're not vulnerable, and they say, wait a minute, you're not vulnerable. You're protecting yourself. What's going on? I need to protect myself. Then suddenly the mind gets involved in the subconscious and the old wounds get involved and nobody's hearing anybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, and actually this makes me think a lot about the deepest relationships that I've been able to create. I have some really good friends, and if I could go back to why those friendships evolved and developed, it's because of the vulnerability that we were able to have together. So I feel like it's very, very powerful as a connection point. So talk to me about an example of when vulnerability was really just, it stood out to you. It was something maybe where you had to be vulnerable or someone else was vulnerable. Talk to me about that.
There's a situation from about 5 years ago where I had to be vulnerable because I needed to get through one of my emotions. So I had somebody I needed to fire. And it was obvious that they needed to go. And I was reactivated by how they were acting and the challenges of expressing to them how I felt about how our interaction was going. And in the past, I'd always just suppressed that, and I'd coldly and calmly or got upset as a way to protect myself so I could just move through the situation with logic and reason. But I was given the gift with this person who was very emotional, logical and reasonable too, but they were very emotional. And I was given the gift of the only way they're really going to be able to hear me is if I could be vulnerable with my own fears of what comes up as I had to sit down and deliver this message and how it could all turn out. Because when we let somebody go, we don't know how it's going to turn out. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've fired many people who've hugged me afterwards. That's a good outcome. But it's not always like that.
I don't know how normal that would be. Yeah, how usually.
It's not the norm. But when we can do it from a place of vulnerability and allow our own emotions to be fluid and come out, then that's what leads to the hug afterwards, because it's done from a personal human perspective. So this person, I had to tell them what they were doing. I had to tell them how I was affected. And that was the hardest part for me, to be vulnerable enough to say, me having to tell you this brings up these issues and these fears for me. And it was very emotional. I cried while I went through it, and they were comfortable with that. I don't remember if they cried or not, but they were emotional also, because they didn't want to hurt me. I didn't want to hurt them. And we both had our issues we brought to the table to work through, our emotional issues, our emotional baggage. But when it was all said and done, I made it through it. He made it through it. And we're friends afterwards, because he didn't receive anything from me that felt judgmental. He knew, because I was willing to be vulnerable and feel my own vulnerability and my own emotions around the situation, he knew they were mine, and I wasn't projecting them on him. So he didn't have anything to throw back at me. And that really helped me get through a challenge that I had needed to get through for many years of, okay, you're a human. I really like you. At some level, I actually love the man. He's a really great guy. And I had to deliver this decision that was going to impact his life. And I didn't want to do that. And I didn't want to express my fears around doing that. And because I was able to, we both walked away from it in a good way. And it wouldn't have turned out well if I wouldn't have been willing to be vulnerable.
I love that. And as a business owner and someone, here, we know you've been very, very successful. I think it's important for us to acknowledge for a minute that someone who's very gifted and is an incredible employee might not be the right fit for your business. And you're going to have to make those, you're going to have to follow your intuition, right? And sometimes make that decision.
So what comes up for me right away, the reason I put my hand up, hey.
Yeah, I know. I sometimes start my sentence and I feel like you know where I'm going with it. So just go with it. Yeah, let's do it.
It's easy to deliver the message if we don't have a reactivation within us. So if somebody is not doing their job and it triggers / reactivates me on something, on my emotional issue from the past I've been hanging on to, logical or reasonable or not, it's my issue that comes up, then I'm not going to be vulnerable when I'm talking to that person, because I'm reactivated. I'm protecting myself, from my own emotions. Then the situation is not pure from a place of love and compassion, what's best for everybody involved. So before I can let somebody go if I need to, or say, hey, we got to find another job for you in this business because you're really valuable and you're good at these things, but you don't fit in this position. So when I work through my issues first, then it's easy to deliver the message, and the message is heard, and it all works out good. The challenge is when I don't own my own issues and my own reactivations, the gifts that this person's challenges are bringing me. I have had people who work for me. I had one person work for me for 10 years. I didn't like the person. And something about him rubbed me wrong. But they did their job really well. And everybody liked them, and they showed up, and they did a great job. So I had to look at myself. What does this reactivate within me? When I worked through that, then they didn't bother me anymore.
That was a gift for you.
It's a gift for me. If I just reacted based on how I felt because of my own baggage, then I would have lost somebody who was really a wonderful person to be around and to work with.
I love that. I'm thinking about vulnerability, and there's a couple things that are coming through for me, but vulnerability and boundaries are one. Also, what do you do? And you can take it in whatever direction feels the best here, but what do you do when you're wanting to be vulnerable with someone, but the other person's very guarded and they're not putting their guard down?
Sometimes we just have to draw boundaries from a place of compassion for ourselves and sometimes for the other person. If they're not ready to go there, then why should we drag them through that? Sometimes we just need to remove ourselves or remove the person from the situation. I've done many mediations between people who weren't getting along, and that is sitting two people down, and each person says, when you do this, this is what it means to me, or this is how I feel. And usually by the time we work through it, whether it's 5 minutes or an hour or an hour and a half, they've become vulnerable, and the other person still accepts them, and it's a bond. It happens. Mm-hmm. But if one person has so many wounds that they're not willing to expose themselves and be vulnerable, then we can't move past that. That happened to me one time. And that person, we still treated them with compassion. They still stayed on, but soon after they made their own choice to leave because they didn't want to be vulnerable. And we showed them who we were, myself as the mediator and the other person who was part of the mediation, the partner, one of the two people in the mediation. They were vulnerable. They were bold enough to show where their reactivation points were, what their fears were, and they showed all that. And fortunately, that other person left. But if not, then it would have been my responsibility to ask them to leave and set the boundary of, you're not having a positive interaction with us. We've been vulnerable. We've been open. We've tried to make this work, and you're not willing to work. Then we have to draw the line. And to an extreme, if I'm in a situation where somebody's going to cause harm to myself or my family or a friend, and I need to protect us in some way and use physical force to protect, I can do that with love for us and love and compassion, even for the other person who's going to put themselves in a worse situation by creating us harm. Or I can do it out of anger, which is my own emotional wounds coming into the situation. So we can set a boundary without judgment. We can set a boundary simply from a place of discernment. This is not best for all. I'm going to stop it in whatever compassionate way I can stop it. So boundaries are not lacking compassion. A boundary done from a place of true emotional vulnerability of feeling, what am I really feeling? Where are my reactivation points? What are my wounds I can heal? Working through those and then taking action to do what's best for everybody involved. That's love. That's a boundary with love.
We're going to have an entirely other conversation about boundaries because this is powerful. And boundaries is, I'm actually reading the book Boundaries right now. I think a lot of us underestimate how important it is to actually hold boundaries when it comes to.
Because our family taught us not to have boundaries because they wanted to manipulate us and control us in some way. It's normal. First of all, most of our parents are young when they had us. Nobody ever showed them a good example, so they're doing the best they can. But if we're doing something that they feel is going to be a problem because it reactivates their emotional wounds within them, they're going to stop us. They're going to set up boundaries, and they're going to feel and believe those boundaries are reasonable, even if they're not, even if they're just to protect that person setting the boundaries, to protect their emotional wounds.
What would you tell a listener who is digging their heels in the sand saying, I do not want to be vulnerable. Vulnerability is not my thing. I'm not going there. What is the detriment? Like, what are they losing out on? What is the thing that they're going to miss in life by not leaning into vulnerability?
The only way to remove the challenges in our life is to think our way through them. And we can't think our way through our emotional wounds, but we think our way through an obstacle. We take physical action to navigate that obstacle different. Or if it's a challenge that continues to come up and reactivate emotions within us, then we have to dig into those emotional wounds and find a way to heal them. Otherwise, the universe, law of attraction, is obligated to continue to bring us situations, people and relationships and situations to reactivate those old emotions within us. We can't turn that off. The universe is obligated to continue to reenact those old emotions, to reactivate those old emotions within us. And the only way we can turn them off completely forever is to go back and dive into them and feel them. Now, it feels like they're going to kill us, but the opposite is true. If we don't deal with our old emotional wounds, then our physical body will react in ways that will eventually kill us. There's a lot of proof of that. Joe Dispenza talks about that a lot now. So the easiest way in the short term is just to suppress it, ignore it, be distracted, do something else. But again, and I know I say this over and over again, but law of attraction, source, the way God interacts with us, it's obligated to continue to reactivate that within us. There's no other way around it. And we have free will of the choice to say, okay, this sucks, but I'm going to dive into the pain. I'm going to find a way to do that. And that's a whole lot of other sessions and a lot of other conversations. But I either take control of it by acknowledging it and healing the wound, or I leave it to the rest of the world to be in charge. And letting the rest of the world be in charge is not a way for us to improve our life.
You're going to continue to, you're definitely going to continue to have opportunities to learn the lesson until you finally learn it once and for all. So any last words for someone who is either really struggling with the idea of vulnerability or is already vulnerable, but maybe there's something that they're not gleaning that they need to hear today?
Find a friend or a teacher or a coach or somebody who's been through something similar that you can express your vulnerability and your feelings to, who you know is not going to attack you. Have to find a partner who's willing to be vulnerable and listen. And sometimes they just listen. Sometimes they give advice. You've got to work that out with each situation. But finding somebody else who's been through something similar is probably the best way to do it. It's tough for us to do on our own. It's not impossible, but it's really tough. So find a partner.
Mm-hmm. A trusted confidant, somebody that can really listen to you without judgment and just be there for you.
Exactly. A trusted confidant. I like that.
I love it. Well, thank you for this conversation today. It's been phenomenal.
You're welcome. Thank you for being here.